It doesn't matter your race, your gender, your political persuasion. Everybody is cared for and provides care in their lives. And I think that that's part of what makes it such an incredibly important issue. It's really universal. We've been here at Oxford a couple days, and we've learned that C.S. Lewis haunted many joints around here, so I'm going to quote him just to locate us in a little bit. He said, "What you see depends a great deal on where you stand." And I think that I'd like to begin having the panel reflect on what they see from where they stand, both at a personal level, at a professional level, and at a national level. And we're going to begin with you.
Thank you very much. What I see and where I stand and all of my coming into the focus on care work has been greatly personal. And as we say, it's also political. But the personal for me is in 2013, I took on a job in one of the global cities, New York, doing international policy work. I relocated with my 5-year-old daughter, and I'm a single mother. But before the end of 2015, I had resigned, and I packed up my bags again and went back to Nairobi. A lot of people did not understand because they saw it as it was an opportunity for me to grow in my work of international policy, but they didn't understand. Even the institution I was working with grappled with these issues. And for me, it was very specific to childcare is very expensive in some of these global cities. But there's also a lack of community support that I feel that I have in Kenya that also speaks to how accessible and easy it is for some of us to pay for care and to establish relationships and maintain those relationships with our communities. But at the same time, I was conflicted because I chose to go and work in a very feminist organization. But in that very organization, the conversation around care, the reflections around care, the need to sort of have an alignment between what we were saying as people who are pushing for recognition of reproductive labor of women, is that there was no space in the organization for that conversation to happen. And so what I did is that I went back to Kenya. And this is the context, the fact that we have a lot of women in Kenya spending and this is a global statistics, 3 to 6 hours of unpaid work. It reduces the number of hours or the entry of women into labor participation. Then in Kenya, we have 40% of rural and 11% of urban households in Kenya where women and girls spend from about half an hour or longer in search of water. So I'm talking about like the informal settlements that are within cities, that water is not necessarily immediately available at your doorstep or inside the household. So then women have to go and fetch water. We're also talking about 1 in 8 Kenyans of the age between 15 to 64 saying that they are economically inactive because they have to spend time taking care of their families. And in terms of economic value, you have 42% share of countries, or 42% globally of countries that actually take time to produce statistics on unpaid work, right? And so Kenya is not one of them. When you go back to being interviewed for a full-time job, people go like, you have a gap in your CV. I'm like, yes, I do have a gap. And it's not really a gap. I was doing consulting work, but employers don't want to listen to the fact that during that time, you are not just sitting around, you actually did part-time work, and it counts, right? But these are some of the complexities and contradictions we are grappling with in a context such as Kenya, and for people or women like me who work national and also global level.
Thank you. Bev, how about you?
Well, I think I began my interest in an academic form. So many years ago, did an ethnography of how working class women's subjectivities are formed over time through care, because caring for others is one way in which women gain value and gain a sense of satisfaction. Care can be deeply satisfying in both giving it and in receiving it. So then followed through with lots of very dense academic debates about the value of domestic labour and all that kind of stuff. So kind of was always interested in it and how it was never factored into economic understanding or economic policy. And for me, that was just outrageous and still is. You know, how is it that it's just not counted? So I got very, I am still very involved in those sorts of debates, although I did spend many years going down very, very lonely tunnels, it felt like, having these debates with myself most of the time. And then my mum got really, really ill and in need of care that I couldn't provide by myself. You know, if somebody needs to go to the toilet in the middle of the night, I would be trying to lift her into the toilet, but I dropped her once and she was in hospital as a result. So thinking I cannot look after my mum by myself, I cannot do a full-time job and look after my mum by myself. My mum was disabled, she was nearly completely blind, she couldn't walk very well, and she couldn't feed herself. And so she fulfilled all the criteria in this country for receiving lots and lots of support. There was none available. We lived in an area where you could not get any sort of care support. Now, that was in 2016 to 17. Now there's been surveys that show there are 7 major care deserts in Britain where there literally isn't any care whatsoever. At the time, it's like, how on earth? So I was at the other end of the kind of care chain in a way, not the migrant care chain, but a life chain. It's how do I look after my mum who needs more than one person? You cannot carry one person by yourself when there is nobody there. So I just literally could not get anybody to come out in the night. I then realised she could go into a care home, but the nurses advised against that and saying they're only fit for enemies and dogs. So the national care homes that are provided by the national state have been cut so much and are so understaffed that the provision that should have been provided for her had been completely disappeared, and they advised me not to do it. Now, I am a university professor. I have a salary that can afford to pay for care because I can also get into debt. And lots of people are now funding care through debt. So I could remortgage my flat to pay for my mother's care. I needed to remortgage my flat because to pay for my mother's care was costing more than it would have cost to send a child to Eton. If I could have got a child into Eton, of course, that's a different matter. But it was costing, and I had to barter with the local care home, £950 they charged a week. Nobody earns that sort of money in Britain. We're the 7th richest country in the world. So in order to look after my incredibly vulnerable mother, incredibly vulnerable but very, very smart, I had to put her into a £950 a week care home, thinking at least if I paid that, she would get really good care. Oh no, of course not. Of course not. They did give her the food she liked, but they didn't help her to eat it. If you're completely arthritic and your hands are like that, you can't feed yourself. They put her into bed at night, so I thought she'd be safe, but they left her there. And they didn't, any lady over the age of 50 usually has to pee at least once a night. When you get to the age of 80, it may be more than that, and they didn't give her a bell and they couldn't get her out of bed. Now, my mother's whole life was invested in being respectable, and she died in conditions of complete lack of dignity, lack of care, where I'd actually thought I'd provided her. I tried to rescue her after 4 days, get her out of there, but it was too late. She died a week later. So my whole career had been devoted to care, to understanding care, and to understand the economics of care. But when it actually came to it, just looking after the people who've cared for me and have loved me and supported me became an impossibility, no matter how rich I was, no matter how much debt I could get access to. And she just died in conditions of inhumanity, I'd say.
A lot of grim pictures. How about Cuba?
I would like to connect with this issue, believing that we should take up our roles and from a very different perspective. And I think that usually when we are wherever, we take our roles in the very limited condition of which is the content of our role. And we don't connect with our personal experience, and we don't put passion into what we do. And for me, this panel has been the opportunity to exchange from those different perspectives. I am not an expert on care or caregiving or whatever, but my view to the care system in general and connected to Cuba, it's how we can create societies that promote interdependence, promote connectiveness, and care in different levels. What does it mean? So it's about care for each other, it's about care for the institutions that are supporting the countries we are living in, it's about care for ourselves, and it's providing care and taking care of us in very different levels, which is not limited for me just to child, adulthood care. It's about everything, how we need each other, and in which levels we can be able to be independent, but also interdependent and dependent, because dependency doesn't have to be exactly something that we have to carry with pain or whatever. So how to maintain that balance. And that has been my approach from the social psychology point of view. And of course, there are a lot of personal experiences that we can share. My connection in a very particular space with caring has been since I am a mom. So it's not just about child care, but it's also about how I feel a lot of times that I have to choose between being a mom, a good mom, and being a professional.
What are the steps out of here? You know, what can our audience and what can we start doing that's going to make any difference at all in kind of changing these assumptions and getting the right people, well, I guess that's everyone, to take responsibility?
Yeah.
Okay. Start from, I think we need, and when you're explaining that, you can sense a different social space where people do still care for each other. And we experience that. And I think when you come from somewhere that's been really brutalised, I grew up with much more care in a community. Yeah. And then it becomes so much more brutal and competitive and individualistic. And I feel as if we do need to go back to that. Because if you think the people who are rewarded the most are the uncaring, the people who get paid the most are the uncaring. They don't do the care, they get somebody else to do the care for them. So the carefree and the careless are almost rewarded for being so. We need to change that. We need to, if we're living in this brutal monetized system where it's only the productive that get reward, and we are in that system. I think you're in a different one. I still do think you're in a much more caring space. Yeah. I'd say we're in a brutal space because we have been so effectively privatized, monetized, commodified, financialized, whichever term you want to use, we are in it. And I think we have to really reorganize our priorities again. I just want to draw your attention to some of the fantastic slides produced by the Oxfam report, Time to Care. It's a critique of wealth again. So the world's 22 richest men own more than the wealth of all the women in Africa. And the monetary value of unpaid care care work is now, and we know statistics on this area are often an underestimation. The underestimation is £10.8 trillion annually of value, which is 3 times the size of the world's tech industry. Tax, very, very important. Taxing an additional 0.5%, that's not even a lot, of the richest 1% of the world's richest men over 10 years could create 117 million care jobs. You know, domestic workers are among the most exploited in the world. Very little legal protection, usually minimum wage. That wage is dropping all the time. And no social security and very, very little protection. Care in the UK is now so intimately connected to austerity policies. We cannot understand care without understanding all the cuts to welfare that have been introduced over the last 20 years by a government of millionaires and billionaires. So, you know, it's not that different from the global picture where there's been a massive distribution of wealth upwards.
I would be really interested in you talking a little bit about your experience or your takeaways from your trip to Cuba, because there's a place where the economic system is different. So did it enlighten you on this issue?
Yeah, definitely. You know, for me, I was really fascinated by the fact that there are what I like to call the infrastructure of care is actually in place, or someone has taken the time to think about it, to think about the mechanisms, to think about the institutions, to think about the human resource and the capacity of the human resource. And this I mean from the health professionals and the intersection or the link with the family level. That one of my key takeaways was the fact that the people, the communities, and the groups that we met with and had conversations with were saying to us that, yeah, you have a system where you can take, for example, the elderly into a place where they spend the day, and when they go back home, the people back home have been trained on how to handle situations, how to be there for their family member who needs that extra care. And sometimes, and some of what Bev was describing by giving the example of your mother, Bev, is that we sometimes think that because the institution is there and because someone has been paid, then everything is catered for, right? But there is the human, and going back to what you're saying, Daybell, is that the human connection, the need to value the relationships as human to human, that happen because of things that we don't talk about. We don't talk about the vulnerability of the human life cycle. We don't imagine that as we grow at some point, that there will be need for more care because someone's life is actually fragile. Their value in life does not stop just because they got to a certain age, right? But the way it is today, and with how everything has been privatized, like if I think about my country, coming back from Cuba, I went to try and see if we do have homes for elderly people. And I was traumatized. You know, I was traumatized. I was traumatized because there was one that I went to, has everything in place, is run by Catholic sisters, and it is really an establishment of the Catholic Church. Then there was another that has both children that are orphaned and has elderly persons, both women and men, that is completely run down, not funded. It's not a government-supported institution. It is people trying to get funds from non-profit establishments. But then it is a situation that is so not so good to see, you know, because it doesn't engage people. It doesn't have the family members of the elderly people that have come in involved. There is no interaction for them with the outside world. In fact, when I asked them, they did say that some of the the elderly people there had been abandoned somewhere in the streets, or some found by the police station or by some hospital, and that's how they ended up there. So not good, not well funded, no connection with where they came from in terms of human relations, and it's very isolating, I think.
How about you, Beth?
Yeah, I loved your point. I think Cuba was a real eye-opener because somebody clearly at some point had thought about social reproduction.
Yeah.
You know, it had been thought about. I think there'd been lots of difficulties implementing it in various different ways because we could see, you know, embargoes have an effect. Embargoes have a huge effect. But you could see that there was the thought had gone into it at a national level. The doctors that we met were very keen. They visited people to make sure they were all right in their local areas, which is stunning when you think that in Britain you're allowed 10 minutes when you've got to get out, and trying to get an appointment is almost impossible. So there had been a commitment to really provide caring. And then I thought the most stunning thing was all the local solidarities, the women's communities that we went into, the hairdressing group that had set themselves up and were providing lots of support. So you saw examples of where those solidarities still existed. And for me, fundamentally, there was a belief that these things were important, a real belief. And so if you think in Britain, 18 years minimum of austerity, you know, government policies on austerity have attacked what are called the unproductive. So they haven't just attacked, they've attacked the welfare system. The welfare system exists for childcare mainly, to support women doing childcare, and for the elderly and for the disabled. The cuts have attacked childcare, elderly and disabled. So many cuts. And when you look at the pattern of them, that's the unproductive, apart from children who will be future labour. So we live in a country where those cuts have been extensive and are continuing. It's a disregard for those who are not productive, where in Cuba it was radically different, radically different. So I thought we could learn a lot from keeping those solidarities in place and thinking about how we support them more. But, you know, if you've got a government determined to kill the unproductive, 40 deaths per day in Britain from unmet care needs. So that is what I would call, it's called austericide, killing the poor, basically. So, you know, we've got that. It felt, and we weren't really there long enough to make sociological comments on the system, but it did feel very different. It felt as if people were more connected to each other, much less brutal.
Does any of that
Does it?
resonate
Yeah.
with you?
I'm dying to hear what you're going to say to this.
Of course, it resonates, and it's a gift for me to hear to your experience and how you connect with them. And actually, it's also a gift because it's something that we can see. I can see from a different perspective. It's something I can share with my people in Cuba from a different perspective. But I don't want people to feel like Cuba is paradise. Because it's not.
No, I think we
Because it's not. And
Difficult.
I think that part of the value of this seminar, of all the exchanges and so, it's how we can learn from each other. And actually, I think that part of that caring and part of that interconnectedness is how we can learn from each other and how we can support each other, not just to say no, to encourage with which are our strengths and to see how we are going to work on our debilities, to say something.
Do you want to talk about immigration a little bit? I know that you're an expert.
I was going to show a map. But I just want to quickly add, though, to the assumptions around care and somehow weave in the migration issue. There are assumptions that women should be the ones providing caring duties, and this in some ways is of course linked to the gender inequality conversation. The other assumption that is also fueled by the way care is organized is that women who provide care, or the carers themselves, or caregivers, do not have care needs, or we tend to forget about them. And that for me is important, because while I know there's been a lot of research that has been done about that, especially by ILO, there is also, when you bring it down to household level, domestic workers or people who have paid to take care of or to take on the caring role from some of us, is that they also have to transfer their caring roles to other people, mostly usually women or daughters in their families, to be able to do that. And so there are assumptions around what it means when you bring in a carer into your space, whether people understand that this is actually work, and whether they interact with care workers as this is work. So the person is doing their work, and not start saying, so-and-so is like one of the families. And then when we've spoken to care workers and some of the domestic workers, like the ones I met in London, they say, but it's confusing, because we also know you cannot treat a family member the way you choose to treat a domestic worker, that they work in very bad working conditions, and the living conditions for the ones that migrate are also questionable. So I wanted to share about this because I draw this from my dissertation. When you look at this map, and this is not conclusive, you will see where some of the African women are going. You can see perhaps from the different colors that you have that stream of African women from different countries that go to the USA, and you do have others, especially from the West African region, going into Brazil. But part of that is that then there is also a going back into Europe that also happened. Then there is a large majority from the East African region going to the Gulf region and going to some of the areas around Middle East. But then you can see there is a connecting dot from the Gulf region that goes all the way to the UK. And the thing is, for us to understand what the employment or work or migration of domestic workers means, in order for them to be able to get to one country and opt out and move to another in Europe, is as a result of running away. The rich people from certain countries find it easy to come and spend their holidays in the UK, or to invest, or to do whatever business they have. And there is a visa that allows them to travel accompanied by their domestic workers. And their domestic workers are then bound by that visa, so they cannot leave, because the visa indicates that the person has been sponsored. So that's one way that has created problems. And there's been a lot of campaigning, and there's been some wins in the UK, for example, based on the activists that have done a lot of work to question, to challenge, and all manner of things. But what the problem is when you look at the African women that have gone to the Gulf region, and the laws there require that they are bound for 2 years based on the arrangement with their employers, and they cannot leave. So when these same employers have traveled with them, say to London, for summer holidays or for whatever business, then these women have been able to escape or to run away. So it is connected to the situations of inequalities in their countries. And so they migrate to richer countries to be able to provide domestic work and to be able to send back money to their countries to take care of their children, their families. And in the meantime, they have transferred their caring responsibilities to someone else in the family, or they've hired someone, usually cheaper, that is coming from a rural setting to be able to take on these jobs.
Let's open the conversation up a little bit here. We want to welcome virtually, if we have the technology all set up, Kripa, who is another senior Atlantic Fellow. She's joining us from her home in Nepal. She is recently completed her degree in equalities and social science from the London School of Economics. And welcome, Kripa.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. I bet this has stirred up some ideas and thoughts for you.
I want to talk more about domestic care workers of Nepal and what they've been facing particularly. And the experiences and how they're looked at is completely, same as what Saida shared. It is basically what all assumptions are there and how these workers are basically looked at, how their bodies are relegated and it's just limited to a free labor in home and cheap labor in the Gulf countries. So talking about Nepal, I would say, introduction of liberalization in Nepal, it kind of led to encouragement of men and women both to migrate to Gulf countries. And in 2011, UN Women, they'd quoted saying that there are almost 244,000 Nepali women going to Gulf countries, driven by the promise of economic incentives. But due to few violent cases against them, Nepal, the government of Nepal, they have actually introduced several bans now and then, and they have been they have introduced this restriction on women's mobility on the basis of their age, their marital status, pregnancy, their maternal status, and even the category of work. And especially this is applicable for women who are low-wage workers. And the ban is still there. So it is more important for us to advocate against this particular ban that is there. So by the looks of it, like care work is commodified for people who can pay and privatized for people who cannot pay. And due to this protectionist restriction, what it has done is it has opened up a market for clandestine and debt financed migration, and also has increased these women's vulnerability. How these women are victims and should be infantilized by inherently portraying them as the vulnerable and they need protection. So I think there's also a need to kind of change that perspective even while we're advocating. And there's a sense of being, of how they are being treated as disposable commodity. There's a need to also talk about how the burden of unpaid care work can be distributed, reduced, and recognized. That is what I think the feminist movement is also talking about. But I also want to ask the panelists to share your thoughts on how can we, look at intersectionalities even with the care aspect, where we're talking about the care right now and also about planet, right? So how can we make those linkages where we're all related in terms of care?
For those of us who are located in the sub-Saharan African region, is that we can see the link between the crisis, the climate crisis, and the change that's going on, and the increase in the unpaid labor that women have to take up. We can see how that is connected to how that labor is when it comes to the agricultural communities and the amount of the time that now women have to spend, especially in farming communities, that they have to spend sorting out the food or what the situation is gonna be. But it might seem so simplistic when I put it that way, but that's actually part of what is happening, is that there is an increase in the caring roles that women have to take up because of the changes that are occurring and the crisis around whether or not they're going to spend more time now looking for water, looking for food, or taking care of whatever farming activities they're involved in. But I think key for all of us to remember is that it is the same forces. It is the lack of care for the planet that is also driving this process, and the two at some point come together, you know. And if we are thinking about alternatives, then we ought to be thinking about how does care of humans and care of the planet look like? What does that society look like, where we actually care about each other and we can do all the things we are saying about how making sure there's public services, making sure there's funding, making sure it is possible for people to access the care they need, but at the same time, the production and the consumption of it is not such that it's not caring to what the planet can support or not support.
I want to connect with this,
Yeah.
because I think that when you are showing that metaphor or that connection between the planet and the caring in an interpersonal level,
Yeah.
you are bringing back the issue of caring. It's about every level
Yes.
of analysis of society. And something that I feel very strongly when we have to share our own experiences from all of it, is like the first thing is that you have to feel the vulnerability of the need of care. And I think that as human beings, and it's not something that I have as a romantic issue, it's something that I have believed through my experiences in different spaces, working in group dynamics, is that we all have a lot of vulnerabilities. And there is also a way in which our institutions are developing, in which looks like there are some who has no vulnerability, and there are some others who are those who should carry it. And we are also reproducing that culture. And we are also reproducing the culture in which there is a perpetuous victim, and there is another one who is the victimary. And I think that it's important that we can all feel our own vulnerabilities, because it's a process of reproduction also, of who is nurturing from who. And when you were talking, for example, about the migration protest that also takes place in Cuba, it's also about the impact of that. Because the good thing in which some people can see the very clear impact, it's money, and how you can then send remittances to our families. But there is an important impact, an important pain coming from those families, in the case that sometimes you can get your children with you, and what is happening with those children, what is happening with the elderly in those families that are taking care of your children, and so on. So I think that it's also about our processes of socialization. And I think something important for us, without a slogan, is to work with children and to work in the education of our young generations. Because if we have to think about how our generations, not just in US, not just in America, that we are closer, but when I see that in Oslo are celebrating Halloween, or when I see that the big heroes are everywhere, it's like, what do we have in mind? And to be a hero, to be Superman, to be Batman, to be all of them, they are the super persons. They don't need each other. They are fixing. No, it looks like funny, but it is not, because what it is in the mind is that I don't need other people because I have everything with me, and it's a way in which I feel that development societies has developed also a feeling of I don't need the other because I am the hero, because I have the technology, because I have the money, I have everything. But in the very basic, you are also very vulnerable because you are losing your capacity to be a human being.
We're going to wrap it up. I know, we barely begun. This has been such a rich conversation. I'm honored to be with you, and I really personally look forward to continuing this conversation, which I know we all want to do. And I guess to the audience, join us. We very much believe it's so important to make this issue visible, to name it, to define our own terms about it, and to work together to be how do you say it? Interdependent. The idea that being interdependent does not mean being weak. It does not mean, it doesn't mean anything soft. It's a very powerful thing, and if we want to make a better world, it's absolutely essential. Thank you very much.